I want to talk to you today about good news or fake news. Now, we know the good news is in the Bible, the famous proclamation of the angels to the shepherds. Do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all people. Today, in the city of David, a Savior has been born. To you, he is Messiah the Lord. But did you know that also fake news is in the Bible? In the account of the resurrection, the soldiers were bribed by the religious leaders to report that the body of Jesus had been stolen by the disciples. And according to the book of Matthew, this report was widely circulated among the people. Whoa, fake news in the Bible. It's amazing. But what is fake news? It's disinformation. Disinformation has been used from time immemorial to discredit the truth, often to undermine a person or policy or institution, to shift the blame. In the message I gave, Why is this pandemic different from all other pandemics? I mentioned the conspiracy theory that was popular during the bubonic plague of the 14th century, saying that Jews had orchestrated this plague by poisoning the wells of the people. And as a consequence, Jews were persecuted and exiled from the European nations. This is an example of fake news. Honestly, most conspiracy theories are fake news. As followers of Jesus, we must be guardians of the truth. We're mandated to speak the truth in love, to spread good news, not fake news. Now, we live in a news-saturated society. So how do we know what news is real and what is fake? Often, real news is not good news, such as the virus COVID-19 kills people. It's real, but it's not good. But fake news is never good news because it does not contain the truth. Rather, its goal is to undermine the truth for the purpose of diverting us from the truth. Listen to the psalmist. Lord, who may dwell in your sanctuary? Who may live on your holy hill? He whose walk is blameless and who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from his heart. I don't know about you, but I want to dwell in God's sanctuary. Thus, we're mandated to speak the truth. So we need to discover the truth. Now, when it comes to news, I believe that there's three types: the good, the real, and the fake. We know that the good news was that in the city of David, a Savior was born, Jesus the Messiah. We knew that the fake news sought to undermine the truth, such as the soldiers' report that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body. So the key is finding the real news. Once we know the real news, we can share the good news. Now, discovering the real news is actually pretty straightforward. In the past, anyway, it was. There were a few news reporting services. There were newspapers, radio, and then later television, who hired professional journalists to seek to discover and reveal the truth. Sometimes the truth exposes corruption, especially in governments or institutions. We remember the story in the Bible about the prophet Nathan, who confronted King David with his adulterous affair with Bathsheba, and who had also concocted a scheme to kill Bathsheba's husband. This is an example of how truth exposes corruption. I was in college during the Watergate era. My father worked for President Nixon. Thankfully, he left the White House 6 months before the Watergate break-in. There were two young reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who did an in-depth investigation of the break-in at the Watergate Hotel. They uncovered incredible corruption at all levels of the Nixon administration. At the beginning, no one believed them, including the reporters' editors, and including the famed evangelist Billy Graham, who happened to be a good friend of Richard Nixon. But actually, as corroborating evidence came out, the truth became known, and the president was ultimately forced to resign from office. It's interesting that there's a similar biblical passage that says, "Your sin will find you out." Its meaning is that the truth will come out and there will be consequences. Was there fake news at the time? Absolutely. mostly coming from the Nixon administration officials and anyone who believed them. Interestingly, Nixon sought to undermine the press because he knew the truth would be damaging. We live in a different society today. Everyone has become their own expert. With social media, anyone can claim anything and they get a hearing. The more preposterous and outlandish, the more popular. Joseph Goebbels, the famous propaganda chief of the Nazis, said, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep reporting it, people will eventually come to believe it." This is what it's come to in our society. I want to make a plug for the mainstream media. I'm sure some of you are immediately skeptical. They're all a bunch of liberals and commies. But ever since my days on Capitol Hill, all the way through my days as a congregational leader, I had dealings with the mainstream media. I remember dealing with a potentially controversial piece of legislation, and a well-known Washington, D.C. muckraking reporter heard about it and called me. I was nervous because I knew if a story came out and it was twisted the wrong way, it could become very damaging. So I decided I'd call him back, I'd answer all of his questions, be completely open about everything. He ultimately was satisfied, and he never wrote the story. Another time, I was invited to a White House meeting, and we were supposed to be quiet about it. It was about a legislation that I was working on. I was good friends of a reporter, and I told him in passing about the meeting. Next thing I know, boom, it was a major headline in the newspaper. Oops, major mistake. Even though we were friends, he had a job to do, report the news. I learned from that one. Following that, I went into the ministry, and I became a rabbi of a Messianic Jewish congregation. These congregations are controversial, especially within the larger Jewish community. Now, I got to know the religious editor of our local newspaper, but he didn't really like us, and he wrote a series of disparaging columns about us. I met with him, didn't change his mind, didn't change the outcome. So what did I do? I prayed. I prayed that the Lord would do something, and eventually he left. A new woman came in. She was much more favorable, and she wrote several pieces that were favorable to our congregation. That same paper later investigated us following a complaint from the public about a particular service that we were providing to the community. This particular complainant was very influential and knew the head of the newspaper quite well, so they were anxious to really look into this question. I knew that, again, if a story came out and it was presented in a certain way, it could be very damaging. So I invited the reporters to come in, meet with us, answer any questions that they had. We were completely open about everything. Ultimately, they didn't write a story about it. Finally, our international oversight organization had organized a tour and a conference in Jerusalem. Just before we all arrived, a reporter with the Jerusalem Post wrote a scathing article about us. When we arrived, I tracked down that reporter and challenged her to listen to us, listen to our side at least before writing an article, and I challenged her journalistic integrity. She agreed to meet. We met with her, and then she wrote an article that was complimentary of our visit to Israel. What's the point of the stories? The mainstream media has a job to do, to find out the facts and to reveal them, and if there is corruption, to expose it. In some ways, it's similar to the prophetic role in the Bible, to call authority to account. All of the mainstream media have rigorous vetting procedures to ensure that what they report is accurate. Even during the Watergate scandal, many stories were held up until corroborating evidence could come along to make sure that what was reported was accurate. Do they make mistakes? Of course they do, but they normally publicly retract a false story. What about the so-called liberal bias of the mainstream media? Everyone is biased. But a true journalist's goal is to discover and to report the truth. The claim that an entire industry is biased is unfounded conspiracy theory. There's a difference between a reporter and an opinion writer or a columnist. A reporter attempts to report the facts. An opinion writer is just that, it's an opinion. If a news service or a TV network is credible, then they will report the news and then provide opinions or speakers that represent different sides. The problem in the United States today, compared to the past, is that people are listening and believing different narratives. But narratives don't change the truth. Just like the report of the soldiers of the disciples stealing Jesus' body didn't change the truth of the resurrection. The goal is to find the truth. Anyone who calls vetted news reporting fake news is undermining the truth. Remember what the psalmist said. If you want to be in God's sanctuary, you must speak the truth. It's incumbent upon us as believers to propagate the truth, not false stories or innuendo or unvetted material. Do your research. Read various reports. Ignore unvetted sources. Remember, most conspiracy theories are fake news whose goal is to divert us from the truth. Remember Yeshua's words. You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. God has given us a mind. Let us use it for good. Thank you, and see you next time.